Hello and welcome to the Canadian History Teacher channel. This video is an introduction to some terms and concepts for a world history course that I teach that covers the time period between 1415 to the present. So since this video is about the basic terms and concepts of the course, we'll start with the most basic term, history. People apply the term history to fields other than history. For example, scientists talk about geological history, and physicians talk about your medical history. There's also archaeological history, in which experts use physical evidence to piece together the story of humankind before anybody wrote anything down. Even though historians often disagree about the details, history must be true, or at least reasonably close to what really happened. Historians use educated guesses too. In this course, for the most part, I will stick to documented human events. History is also a written account, or at least on film and video, it often starts as oral history, but until the tale is set down in some permanent form, it's too easy for facts to get lost or changed. Things written down aren't immune to exaggeration, but there is something about the spoken word that invites changes that adapt to personal needs, audience, or context. Oral stories, then, are more likely to create a mythical tale than an account of the past. Once an account or story is printed or recorded, its context is fixed through time. Documentation creates history, and history is based on documentation. So now that we've talked about the definition of history, let's talk about prehistory for a minute. Because history needs to be set down in some kind of permanent record, it dates back only about as far as the written word, which some scholars say the Sumerians invented, at least in pictograph form, around 3500 BC. Among the best early record keepers were the Egyptians, who invented their own form of writing called hieroglyphics around 3000 BC. Before written history, it was prehistoric times. Let's talk now about a few acronyms that are commonly used in history text and courses: BC, AD, BCE, and CE. The year 1535, when Cartier landed at present-day Quebec City, are AD, just like this year is. AD stands for Anno Domini. That's Latin for the year of our Lord, referring to the Christian era or the time since Jesus was born. Time before this period has been designated as BC, which stands for before Christ. Historians now prefer CE for Common Era instead of AD, and BCE for before Common Era instead of BC. The new initials aren't tied to just one religion. AD and BC, however, are what most people are used to. They're widely understood and deeply ingrained, so you may still hear them used or see them in text you read in this course. The years BC are figured by counting backwards. That's why the year that Alexander the Great died, 323 BC, is smaller than the numbers of the year that he was born, 356 BC. Yet, Alexander didn't think of himself as living in backward counting years 3 centuries before Christ, any more than Augustus Caesar of Rome wrote the date 1 AD on political documents. This system for dating years came about a lot later when scholars superimposed their calendar on earlier times. Given that Jesus actually may have been born a little earlier than 1 CE, perhaps in about 6 BCE, the system isn't even particularly accurate. It is usually safe to assume, though, that a 4-digit year without 2 capital letters following in it takes place during the Common Era, or CE. So before we move on, just take a minute to look at the timeline of Western intellectual history. It will serve as an example of how BCE and CE function in the larger historical record. Note that prior to the event marked by the label Roman, the years in the BCE time period are expressed in reverse order, and the dates after this same time period progress and accumulate in a linear forward fashion. Another thing that confuses some history students is the way centuries are named and numbered. We are currently living in the 21st century, even though the actual year in numbers starts with a 20. Why are the dates within the century and the title for that century off by 1? Because the first century began in the year 0. And when the numbers exceeded 100, it became the second century, and so on. The centuries before the Common Era works the same way, but in reverse. So the 21st century BCE also starts with the year 2000, just like in the 21st century in the Common Era. So let's talk for a minute about bias, particularly the bias in history. Some intellectuals question the very concept of history. Whose history are we talking about? If the victors do indeed write history, why do we accept a one-sided account of the past? What about the undocumented experiences in the past? What about cultures that rely on oral traditions? What about people out of power? So much of history is so overwhelmingly about people with privilege and power. We have to remember, though, that history is a human creation, so there will be bias. You have to factor in the biases of the time in which the events happened, the biases of the time when they were written down, and the prejudice of the scholars who turned them over and over again, decades and often centuries later. It cannot be helped that so many conquerors, monarchs, politicians, soldiers, explorers, and yes, historians, have also been men. It's just as true that conventionally taught world history still spends a fair amount of time on Europe, how it was shaped by other parts of the world, and how other parts of the world have shaped Europe. There are other stories worth telling, other points of view, other truths, and some are covered in this course, lightly touched upon, just like everything else here. But to be honest, the tilt is still towards a male-centered history of what has been called, quote-unquote, Western civilization. Why? Because it's a large span of time covered in this course. It's understood from a well-documented and widely disseminated tales of how the world became what it is. It's easy to think of 100 years as a long time, and 1,000 years as a long, long time. The modern habit is to chop up history and social trends into little decade-sized chunks, the 1980s and 1990s, and so on. But if you step back a bit and consider how long human beings have been doing a lot of the same things people do today, buying, selling, cooking, falling in love, traveling, and fighting wars, you can gain a broader perspective that is both humbling and enriching. Whether you define now as a day, a year, or a decade, it's both a minuscule sliver of history and a part of a much larger story. One of the best parts of being human is that you have more than your own experience to rely on. Language, lore, reading, writing, and more recently, digital information help people to build on what their ancestors discovered generations, centuries, and a millennia ago. History is a big part of what defines humanity. Some may say it's the biggest part. It led to the present. It led to you. And understanding your story will be rewarding. This course is a general view of how human history has gotten you and the world you live in to its current reality. The earliest human beings were hunters and gatherers. There may be a slim chance
that you're still living that way, spending all your time and energy intent on getting food from the natural world around you. But I very much doubt it. Instead, you're a student, an office worker, a homemaker, a cable TV installer, or you perform any thousands of occupations unimagined by early humankind. You use tools like cell phones and laptop computers, things hardly dreamed of when I was born in 1969, let alone back at the dawn of civilization. Yet here I am, clacking away on a computer keyboard, checking messages online, and listening to a podcast, just like a modern human being. And in a way, here too are the people of 30,000 years ago, my ancestors and yours. In the grand scheme of things, all modern humans. Life was different 30,000 years ago, to be sure. They may have thought a lot about root plants, berries, seeds, probably even insects and grubs, shellfish when it was in season, meat when it was available, and calorie-rich bone marrow from fresh or scavenged kills. They literally had to scrounge to get what they needed to stay alive. In the warm climates where early members of our species lived, survival may not have been very difficult. After all, they were endowed with the same basic mental equipment we have today. They were big-brained, tool-using animals, and after many tens of thousands of years living hand-to-mouth off of what they could find or kill, some of them decided there had to be a better way. Maybe pushed by circumstances or somehow inspired by the thought of new possibilities, people eventually traveled from the lush forest savannas and seacoasts of Africa to face the harshest challenges of virtually every environment on Earth. Mountains, deserts, frozen steppes, and remote islands. Eventually, they traded in their stone spearheads and scrapers for tools and weapons made of copper, then bronze, then iron, and ultimately things like microcircuits and aerospace technology. Those people traveled and adapted and innovated all the way to today. They are you and me, and in a weird way, then is now. At some point, around 10,000 years ago, not very long after the last ice age ended, some people whose technology still consisted largely of sticks and rocks settled down. They were discovering that if they put seeds in the ground, plants would come up there, and it worked even better if they stuck around and tended the plants. This realization led to farming. Historians point to an area called the Fertile Crescent as a hotbed of early farming. Shaped like a slightly mangled croissant, the Fertile Crescent stretched from what is now western Iran and the Persian Gulf, up through the river valley of today's Iraq, into western Turkey, and then hooked south along the Mediterranean coast and the Jordan River through Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestine territories into northern Africa and the Nile Valley of Egypt. In my flaky croissant analogy, the eastern Mediterranean is the part in the very center curvature. The crescent is also where the archaeologists have found some of the oldest cities in the world. The mantra for the beginnings of civilization goes something like this. Agriculture means a reliable source of food. People stay put and grow food. Ample food enables population growth. Ample food also gives a growing population commodities to trade. Trade leads to more trade, which leads to more goods and wealth. Now, not everyone has to work in the fields. Some folks can specialize in shipping goods, for example. Others can specialize in building, or perhaps concentrate on making weapons, either to protect their own wealth or take it away from others. Artisans create jewelry and turn mundane objects into aesthetic statements. Society gets more multi-layered. Buildings rise, cities rise. Trade necessitates keeping track of quantities and values, which necessitates a way of record keeping. Number systems get invented, writing follows, books get written, ideas blossom, more trade results, cross-cultural influences appear, and so on. The next thing you know, an English-speaking woman in Los Angeles, whose various ancestors spoke Spanish, Celtic, and Japanese, is sitting in her South Korean-made car, stuck in traffic on a freeway, which is a style of limited access road invented in Germany. She's sipping a cup of coffee harvested in El Salvador, brewed with an Italian style from a machine manufactured in China to Swiss specifications. On her car's satellite radio, a voice is beamed in from Toronto introducing news stories filled by reporters in India, Afghanistan, and the Ukraine. She reaches over and switches the station that features a style of music invented in Jamaica by English-speaking people of African descent. Now it's your turn to think about all of the terms and concepts that we've discussed. Create a world history timeline that has enough items on it to reflect the concepts that we've discussed today.